So with that, the collective intelligence of boards, let me introduce Mike Richardson.
Everything can change in an instant. Fortunately, on this occasion, we did not need these. These are crash recorders, black boxes, the first business I ever ran, designed, developed, and produced these. We went on to evolve another kind of recorder that's not crash protected. A crash protected recorder, a black box, actually isn't black. But we did make a black box that was uncrash protected. It's called a quick access recorder. We started making these things back in the 80s, hence the cassette tape, and then optical discs, and then solid state, where you would remove the media after every single flight. You would crunch the numbers through a data warehouse using algorithms, and you would look for trends that would foreshadow incidents and accidents. This became known as flight operations quality assurance, not flight operations quality control right after something bad just happened. Now, you might be asking, why are there two crash recorders? Well, there's one for the flight data, and there's one for the cockpit voice, because we want to hear the conversation flow of what's happening in the cockpit. Not just the words, not just the transcript, but the tone, the confusion, the calmness or lack of calmness, the composure that's starting to break down, a miscommunication, a question that was missed, a decision that wasn't followed by an action. Did we hear the click of that switch? Did we hear an alarm that they didn't hear? Did we hear a bang? Now, you might be wondering why I'm talking about this with you. And before I ran that company, I used to fly offshore on helicopters, off drilling rigs, because I was a petroleum engineer. And we became a specialist in building crash recorders that had both flight data and cockpit voice in one box. Because on a helicopter, the weight and space constraint is such that if you could do it in one box, that was so much better. And of course, I lived that life. And we know how hazardous that environment is because we all saw the BP Gulf oil spill. And I started to ask myself the question, what if we'd had a cockpit voice recorder on the drilling rig listening to that conversation flow, rather than having to rely upon a movie to understand what happened? And I started to go a little bit further with that, and it started to inform how I think about boards, and how I think about agility, and how I think about future-proofing ourselves, given all the VUCA that's coming at us, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And we've heard lists after lists after lists of risks and disruptions and massively complex issues that we have to deal with in business these days that are massively volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And I started to ask myself the question, well, what if we had a cockpit voice recorder in the boardroom? Not for the transcript, not for the minutes, but to hear the tone, to hear the composure, to hear questions that got missed, to hear thinking, to hear the mode, the tension, the friction, the inertia. What if we'd had a cockpit voice recorder in the boardroom of BP over the previous 10 years before the BP Gulf oil spill? Because I'd led that life on drilling rigs, I read every single word of every single report about the BP Gulf oil spill, because I'd lived the life. And the official report concluded that that was a disaster waiting to happen progressively for 10 years. In other words, disasters don't happen all of a sudden. They happen slowly, 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 and then all of a sudden. So then I asked myself, well, what if we had a cockpit voice recorder in the boardroom of Boeing right now? Over the last few months with Boeing, over the last 5 years with Boeing, regarding the whole 737 MAX situation that we've been through. Then I thought to myself, well, let's take another example. What about a cockpit voice recorder in the boardroom of Ford? And all the debate that they're having right now about EVs and the Ford F-150 Lightning truck and all that kind of stuff. And then I realized, well, this gentleman would have a lot to say about those last two examples of the conversation flow occurring in the boardroom of Ford that he turned around from 2006 to 2014. And before that, he was the CEO of Boeing Commercial Airplanes. And after I ran that crash-protected recorder business, I built the business and got promoted to run the aerospace division of a British public company. I made 3 acquisitions over here in the USA, which is what brought me to the States in 1999. And we put together this whole integrated system and solution set, and we ended up forming a strategic alliance with Boeing, the Boeing Connection division of Boeing. And we ended up forming what's called a working together strategic alliance team with Boeing. And so I started to really hear and understand what Alan Mulally was up to in Boeing with this whole working together leadership and management system. So when he went to Ford, I followed him very closely because I suspected that this could turn into one of the biggest corporate turnarounds of all time, which indeed it did. One thing led to another, and in 2017, I got introduced to Alan Mulally. And I started to have a conversation with him about working together and agility and collective intelligence and all those kinds of things. And I explained to him that by then, for nearly 20 years, I'd been running peer forums of CEOs and executives, tapping into the collective intelligence of a confidential, no conflict of interest peer forum of CEOs. You might recognize Mark Nielsen there at the back. If you know Mark, he sat right there, and he's at the back of that picture in the back row, 4th from the left. That's Mark Nielsen, a slightly younger version of Mark Nielsen. And so I invited Alan Mulally to come to my peer forum for the afternoon. You can see him there in the middle of the picture beside the gentleman in the red jumper. He loved it. He adored it. He started to talk about how it was a much deeper version of working together like he'd not experienced before. So I followed up with him afterwards, and we had a dialogue that unfolded, and he really encouraged me to write a book about agility because we went deep into the concept of agility and the agility approach that he'd taken at Ford and Boeing. And he said, Mike, you've got to put this into a book. So I worked with a couple of co-authors, and we put into a book, The Peer-Powered Culture of Agility, which we called The One Advantage. And in particular, he really glommed onto a core concept of the book, where I tried over the last 20 years that the domain of agility has been an exploding universe of inspiration around agility. And I wanted to really cut through the complexity and the hype. And I shared with him this concept, and he said, you've got to put that in the book. That's got to be front and center. That describes what I did at Ford. And I call it C2C, conversation flow to cash flow. You see, what I want to suggest to you is this. Cash flow is not king anymore. Conversation flow is king, and cash flow is a way of keeping score. GE used to have fantastic cash flow, and now they don't. And they've been kicked out of the Dow Jones Industrial Average, they've been broken up to some degree, and their share price is clawing its way back now from having stumble-bumbled along the bottom. So what I want to suggest to you is that conversation flow is king. Cash flow is a way of keeping score. So now what I want to ask you then is, well, how collectively intelligent is your conversation flow in your governance boards? How collectively intelligent is your governance board system in driving conversation flow to cash flow? You show me a company with poor cash flow, I will show you a company with poor conversation flow, and it won't take long to do it. So I went looking for leading edge thinking in the field of governance systems. And in particular, I was intrigued about the advisory board side of that governance system equation. And I found an organization called the Advisory Board Center out of Australia, but increasingly becoming a global company. And they put together, once every 2 years, they put together a research report called the State of the Market Report. I'm going to give you a link to it later. It's a 50-page report that I will urge you to read, please. I'm just going to give you some headline stuff. The number one mega trend that research report reveals is that there's a convergence of a governance system with the governance board side and the advisory board side increasingly coming together with, of course, a bright line of fiduciary responsibility right down the middle, but the governance system is being upframed now to be inclusive of both. Why? Because the governance board is being increasingly squeezed by a massively growing agenda and increasing board constraints. We've heard so much about that over the last few sessions and couple of days. So the Advisory Board Center is a global organization that is on the leading edge of researching and professionalizing this sector with more than 650 advisors around the world. And when you look at the report, you'll see lots of nuggets of data and trends, and it'll show you the footprint. It'll give you corporate examples of corporates that use not just governance boards, but also advisory boards. It'll talk about the advisor side of the equation. It'll talk about the organizational side of the equation, and talk about the impact. And I hope that you will go and download it and digest it and read it. This is the founder, Louise Brookman, and she had a business that did very well in Australia. She's based in Brisbane, and she was struggling to grow and go international. And she decided, I'm going to form an advisory board. Next thing you know, 5 to 10 years later, she's in 18 different countries, been phenomenally successful. She sold that company for a great exit, and she realized, I really think that advisory boards have a place in the world. She did a 5-year research study, and then she started the Advisory Board Center, and now she is building out that footprint very, very, very successfully. And this is what she said. Advisory boards provide flexibilities to supplement the conversation about the future, collectively, not just playing defense, but also playing offense. It's all about the arc of getting that advisory input. And up there, you see the concept of an advisory board, which can start from an informal kind of advisory board and work its way up to the more formal. You see the concept of peer advisory boards there. That's what Mark and I now do here in San Diego with an organization called REF. We run peer forums here. You see the concept of project advisory boards, where many corporates are now getting into the advisory board business by launching a project advisory board first for cybersecurity or artificial intelligence or talent management in the new world of work and that kind of thing, and then ending up in that place of a best practice advisory board, all to drive more collective intelligence as an approach. I'm on 2 advisory boards, one for a startup retail organization in Miami, and another one for the most massive project I've ever been involved with, called Project Moon Hut, that is a 40-year project and has a collection of for-profit and not-for-profit entities, all about what's called a Moon-Earth ecosystem, or MERth. And it's just a bewildering endeavor that I'm really, really, really proud to be on the advisory board of, and I'm indeed chairing that advisory board. So what I'm trying to invite you to think about is, how do you take a more collective, intelligent approach with your governance systems? And how do you think about the role that an advisory board can play in helping to future-proof the organization with the agility required? And there's really only one question left to answer. And that is, well, what is collective intelligence? We've talked about crash recorders and uncrash protected recorders, flight operations quality assurance. We've talked about flight data and cockpit voice. We've talked about collective intelligence as artificial intelligence and human intelligence and systems factors and human factors. And Jessica asked me, she said, Mike, could you run a quick experiment to judge if we've got the right people in the room? Do we have the collective intelligence in the room that we need? So you know what collective intelligence is? It's that idea that the whole seems to have an intelligence all of its own above and beyond the parts. We see it in so many different ways in nature. Relatively unintelligent individual actors can become part of a very intelligent system. And there's a great book that was written a few years ago called The Wisdom of Crowds, in which they tell the story of Francis Galton in 1906, who went to a country fair in Great Britain with an ox. And he asked the passers-by to buy a ticket to guess the weight of the ox. And amazingly, when he tallied up all the answers of the hundreds, maybe thousands of people that participated in this, the ox weighs about 1,000 pounds. The average of all of those answers was within 1 pound of the correct answer. Now, the idea being that the unexpert many can actually come up with a better answer than the expert few. Now, I thought about dragging an ox out on stage here, but I figured that the Guggenheim wouldn't be very happy with me. Lots of other people have done this jelly beans in a jar and guess how many jelly beans, but I don't have that much use for that many jelly beans. But, and by the way, this is my colleague Mark Redgrave here. He's done 3 massive agile transformations in the last 10 years. Thank you very much, Mark, for being my magician's assistant. I don't have that much use for that many jelly beans, but boy, oh boy, do I have this much use for that many golf balls. So please, if you would take out your phones, please, and if you would go to your browser and you would go to menti.com, just go to menti.com through your browser, and if you would type in that number, no spaces required, 2215-8342, 2215-8342, you will see a screen like that where you get to slide the slider along the screen to the number of golf balls that you think are in this jar. Everybody getting there? Okay, so slide the slider to the place of how many golf balls you think are in this jar. Everybody getting there? All right, let's show the screen. Okay. So far, we've got 48, 51, 53 people. And we're coming in with an average of 155. Not too bad. Jessica, the right answer is 122. That's not too bad. I think we can work with this audience that we've got here. If I can get my PowerPoint back. I hope that I've invited you to look at your governance system through some fresh eyes, some fresh lenses, to use an advisory board to expand your radar scope, to see that VUCA stuff coming at you earlier so that you see it before it sees you coming like a fool. That's what VUCA's trying to do to you. It's trying to make you look foolish. I invite you to go to the link here or take a photograph of that QR code. That will take you to a link. If you scroll down, you'll find the State of the Market report. I invite you to think about what advisory boards can do to help you be more agile in the future. Thank you.